Thank you so much. We know that there are many things happening this week all over the city, and it is delightful to see this room so full and to see the energy among all of you in your conversations in between these really profound panels. My name is Lindy von Mutius, and I'm the director of the Salata Institute's Climate Action Accelerator. And in addition to my colleagues who work at the Salata Institute, the Accelerator works really hard to match faculty expertise with practitioners and people who can take those research ideas and expertise and translate them into climate action. So I'm very delighted to be able to introduce this next panel, which is indeed composed of both faculty experts and people who are translating that expertise and those ideas into action. You may not know, if you haven't perused the Salata Institute's website, that the Salata Institute, among other things, also funds research clusters where we pull faculty from all over the university together around specific research questions. And one of the earliest research clusters the Salata Institute funded was one that explored how to mitigate methane emissions. And so the folks on the stage, Carrie, Jenks, and Daniel Jacob, are part of that research cluster and some of our best thinkers at Harvard on this issue, looking at it from both law and regulation as well as science. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. We've got Marcelo Mena from the Global Methane Hub. We've got Daniel Jacob, who is the Vasco McCoy Professor of Atmospheric Chemistry and Environmental Engineering at Harvard. And we've got Carrie Jenks, who is an accomplished attorney and the Executive Director of the Harvard Law School's Environment and Energy Program. I'd like to share just a little bit about each of them to help ground this conversation. Some of you might be also thinking about an election that's happening pretty soon from now. And this is a panel where you're going to hear about some of the ideas that are at play in what happens both in the regulations and the science coming up, but also what might happen after. So I hope you have a lot of great questions to contribute. So Mr. Mena is a professor at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Valparaíso and the former environment minister for Chile from 2014 to 2018. As a minister, he spearheaded multiple international environmental initiatives, including helping craft a landmark agreement to phase out coal power generation and South America's first carbon taxes for power generation and new car sales. Previously, he was a practice manager at the World Bank, where he led a team that created the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. Daniel Jacob, as I said before, is a professor in our engineering sciences faculty, but he received his PhD from environmental engineering from Caltech. His research covers a wide range of topics in atmospheric chemistry, from air quality to climate change. He has led the development of the GeosChem Global 3D model of atmospheric composition, has served as a mission scientist on 8 NASA aircraft missions around the world, and is also a member of several satellite science teams. He's purported to be the #1 environmental scientist in the world, according to research.com. So we're all quite fortunate. And as executive director of the Environmental and Energy Law Program, Carrie Jenks leads that team to identify legally durable strategies to support climate and environmental policies and advance clean energy deployment. With her legal and policy expertise in climate and environmental law, she has worked to build strategic alliances among stakeholders in a variety of contexts. Before Harvard, Carrie was in private practice at Goodwin & Procter and Wilkie Farr & Gallagher, and she received her JD from Georgetown University. So thank you three for sharing your insights with us today. I welcome the discussion.
Thank you, Lindy.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here to talk about methane. There's a lot of interest in reducing methane emissions as a way to slow down climate change as we deal with the difficult but necessary task of decarbonizing our economy. The temperature of the Earth has risen globally by 1.2 degrees Celsius over the past century, and we understand very well that about half of this warming is due to CO2. And if you were at the last panel, you know that the time scale that's involved in this is pretty long. CO2 has a residence time in the atmosphere of about 100 years, although it's a bit complicated. But it's only 50% of the warming. We also have 30% of the warming that comes from methane. And methane has a much shorter lifetime in the atmosphere, about 9 years. It gets oxidized. And then we have another 20% from a bunch of other gases like N2O and halocarbons that have pretty long lifetimes. Okay, so that overshoots the observed warming, and that's because we have aerosol particles in the atmosphere of human origin that have short lifetimes but reflect solar radiation out to space and result in cooling the planet. And in the last panel, we talked about solar geoengineering, which would basically increase the size of this aerosol bar in order to abate warming. But another way to abate warming in the short term is to go after methane. If I get rid of methane, anthropogenic methane that is, I reduce the warming by about 30%. And this can happen on a time scale of a decade or two because of the short lifetime of methane. Okay, so this would allow us to stay within probably not 1.5 degrees of danger, but 2 degrees of danger as we go through the urgent task of decarbonizing our economy. But that's going to take some time. Now, when we look at the methane rise over the past century, it's gone by fits and starts, but the pre-industrial concentration we know from ice cores was about 650 parts per billion, so it has tripled since then. The dominant natural source of methane is from wetlands, where methane is produced by decomposition of organic matter under conditions devoid of oxygen. And that's about 20 to 40% of the current source of methane. We have a bunch of anthropogenic sources. We have rice paddies, which are essentially human-made wetlands. We have waste, landfills, wastewater treatment plants, in which the same mechanism of decomposition of organic matter happens as in wetlands to generate methane, and also the ruminants. Again, the same kind of process happening in the stomach of ruminants and in manure ponds. A very different type of production of methane comes in fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are produced under conditions of high pressure and temperature in the Earth's interior, and methane is one of the products of this decomposition of organic matter that happens under those conditions. And when we extract those fossil fuels, we will tend to emit methane to the atmosphere unless we're super careful. So in the case of oil and gas, about 10 to 20% of the anthropogenic source is coming from that sector. And then when we mine coal, there's a lot of methane that is released together with that we need to vent, if only for safety reasons. And again, that contributes significantly to the total amount of methane. Now, you will notice that there are ranges given to all of these sources, and that's because the sources of methane are pretty complicated. They're associated with biology, they're associated with leaks, and that's pretty difficult to quantify. Now, you might say, well, maybe we don't need to quantify them that well, because decreasing methane emissions should be really relatively easy, certainly compared to CO2. And maybe one way to look at it is that we don't have the stockage problem that is a major barrier to controlling CO2 emissions. In the case of pipeline, just fixing leaks, venting practices, oil and gas industry, flare excess gas or use it, and so on. Okay, each of the sectors responsible for methane emissions has a potential solution that is not really that hard to achieve. But the problem is that methane actually comes from a zillion of individually small sources. In the US, we have 1,300 landfills. A typical oil and gas field has thousands of individual devices. And at any point in time, those could be emitting quite a bit of methane. So this is very difficult to actually police. Now, one thing that we can do is observe methane from satellite. And this has been my business for about a decade, figuring out different ways of observing methane from satellite and then interpreting this. What I'm showing you here is work from my student, Nick Velasquez, using the satellite instrument Tropomi that has been in space since 2018 and gives you global daily observations. Global daily observations. Basically, that means methane cannot hide. We will track it wherever it is. And so what do we see? Well, we see that we have hotspots over China, and we understand that's associated with coal, livestock, landfills. We have rice in Southeast Asia. We have livestock, landfills. Wetlands in the tropics are a major source of methane. And then as we go to the Americas, oil and gas, livestock, and in the United States, we have pretty large emissions associated with oil, gas, livestock, and landfills. Okay, now I showed you the curve of methane rise with time, and one thing that concerns us is that the methane growth over the past decade has been accelerating. We now understand pretty well that this recent rise of methane is mostly because of sources in the tropics. And they're probably associated part with the rising tropical livestock, but also methane emissions from wetlands that are may represent a feedback from climate change associated with increasing inundation, and something that we're working hard to understand. But that doesn't mean that it gets the US off the hook, because the emissions from the US account for about 10% of global anthropogenic methane emission, even though we're about 4% of the population. So now what I'm showing you here is the satellite information that we get from the US, and it shows the different major sources. This is a Permian Basin that we have a lot of interest in. Here you see a lot of livestock in the Central Valley of California. You also see livestock in eastern Washington. In the upper Midwest, you see some rice in Arkansas. You see all kind of really, really cool stuff. You still see urban emissions, for example, Chicago, and so on. So what we can do with those satellite observations is to infer the corresponding emissions of methane. And for this, we need to work with an atmospheric transport model. And there's quite a bit of mathematics involved with this, which I'm certainly not going to bore you with. But in the end, what we can do with this is to evaluate the emission inventories that are produced by the EPA and submitted on an annual basis to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this is something we actually do for all countries around the world. We compare the emissions that we get from satellites to their UNFCCC report. But for the purpose of this panel, I'm focusing on the US. And so what I'm showing you in blue is the US EPA inventory and the contributions from the different sectors. So the major sectors recognized by the EPA are livestock, oil and gas, and landfills. And we agree that those are the major sectors. When we look at it from satellite, the livestock source seems about right, but the oil and gas source is way too low, and the landfill source is also way too low. And so we've been working hard to try to understand what's going on here. And we've been thankful for support from the Harvard Methane Initiative to dig into this a little deeper. And what I'm going to do now in the next few slides is tell you about some very recent research from my group that we've been doing, also working with Carrie, Jenks, in trying to understand these underestimates of emissions. So what I'm showing you here is a setup that we have put in place to monitor continuously emissions from oil and gas basins in the US. And here I'm showing it you for the Permian Basin. And you see we're going all the way up to 2024. And what we find is that emissions from the Permian Basin have not really changed since 2019. And by using some different types of satellite, and we've been very excited recently to work with geostationary satellites, be happy to talk about this offline, we see those major point sources that are very intermittent puffs coming out of the Permian. Now, one thing that you hear about a lot is that the oil and gas industry in the United States has been getting cleaner and cleaner. And the way that this is measured is by the methane intensity. So the methane intensity is defined by the amount of methane that you emit from oil and gas activities divided by the gas production, what you take to market. In other words, the gas that you emit that you could otherwise make money out of. And this has been decreasing. But this has been decreasing because production has been increasing. It's not because emissions have gone down. And so you've been playing with the denominator here and not with the numerator. So this is kind of not good. And in fact, what we find is that the methane emission from oil and gas fields is really unrelated to production. So in other words, this whole methane intensity metric, to me, is bogus. And this is really relevant because the EU right now, as you probably know, some of you may know, has implemented a requirement for gas that they import to have a methane intensity below a certain threshold. And I think this is fairly ill-advised, and maybe something we can talk about. Okay, I want to also talk about landfills. And this is we've been taking this from a broader perspective of urban emissions. And we've been motivated by the fact that climate action doesn't take place only at the level of a country, but it can actually take place at the level of states or municipalities, which may be very interested in dealing with climate change. So as you might be expect, cities are an important source of methane. We see that from space, concentrated population. And why would that be a source of methane? It's really because of gas distribution and landfills, and to a lesser extent, wastewater treatment. So when we look at this from satellite and compare to the EPA emission inventory, what we find is that urban emissions are quite a bit higher than what the EPA would say. And this has both to do with natural gas distribution, which is leakier than is assumed, and also the sources from landfills. And Carrie and I have been very interested in the sources from landfills because EPA is right now trying to formulate new regulations for landfill emissions. And Carrie, I'm sure, will be talking to you about this. So we took a little bit of a deeper dive into this. This is all really brand new stuff. But we have used our satellite to look at emissions from individual landfills. And here I'm showing you an example from a landfill in North Carolina. And so we can quantify the emissions, as we see from the landfills, and compare to the emissions reported by the landfill to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, which is the EPA program by which large sources have to report their greenhouse gas emissions. And what we find is that the emissions are much larger than what is reported. And also, very importantly, what you see here is that the emissions are relatively flat, as we see from satellite. Maybe they're increasing a little bit, but the emissions from the GHGRP are steadily decreasing. Now, when we look at this a little bit more, we see that landfills, when they report their emissions to the GHGRP, they can use either of two methods. A so-called recovery first model, in which they look at how much methane they recover and assume a certain recovery efficiency. The other way is with a generation first method, in which they look at the waste in place, the new waste that they bring in, and have a certain decay rate for the waste to turn into methane. And then they can choose what model they report to the EPA. And what you see is that there's a huge difference between the emissions from the generation first model and the emissions from the recovery first model. Now, no surprise, most landfills report emissions from the recovery first model because that means lower emissions. And those emissions have been going down. Yeah. And when you look at the EPA inventory and the EPA emission that they report over the past 10 years, these emissions have been going down. Success, but not really. What we find is that, in fact, emissions have not been going down, and in fact may have been going up in the recent, anyways, this was my last slide, so this is perfectly fine. Okay, now we're back to where we started. Let's get out of here. Right. So basically, there's a lot of work to do in this landfill regulation business, and I'm sure that Carrie is going to touch on this in her presentation to follow mine. Thank you very much for your attention. Carrie.
Great. The slides. I'll give it 1 minute while we get the slides up. I think just to kick it off and pick up where Daniel left off, I think we're in a methane moment at this time because I think we're getting so much more information. So as Daniel was talking about, we're getting more information about how EPA has underestimated landfill emissions. We're getting a lot of satellite information from oil and gas. And so the question is, how do you translate all of this information into regulations? I think if you get more information, companies start to learn how they can act. Regulators can start to think about how do they translate that into requirement. But I do think we need regulations that require emission reductions. That can be through incentives. It can be through actually requiring a company to install a technology or to operate practices differently. But I think we focus on how do you design a regulation that's durable. And by durable, I mean how do you make sure it sticks? Can companies implement it and achieve the emission reductions that were targeted? Do courts uphold it? And can agencies actually enforce against it? And so we think about how do you design a regulation? I think it's really easy to often look at federal regulations or state regulations and tell an agency what they did wrong. It's easy to poke holes in that. But what is hard is to figure out how do you tell them to solve it? How can they do it differently? And that's what we work on in the program that I work with. What EPA needs when they're doing a regulation for climate or for methane is they need to help, they need stakeholders to help them translate the data into the legal constructs that they have. In this case, I'll talk a lot about the Clean Air Act. They also have to think about courts, and at the moment, courts are really constraining what agencies can do. So that translation role, I would argue, is even more important now. So I'll walk through a few slides, but as Daniel mentioned, we focus on the largest sources in the US. We think about landfills, we think about agriculture, and we think about natural gas systems. The information that we have on these, as well as the tools that we have, are different though. And so thinking through the opportunities and the regulatory challenges are a little different. So I'll walk through each of those. I thought it would be good to step back, though, and explain how we approach these problems. So we often are convening diverse stakeholders, thinking about NGOs, companies, regulators, academics, and translating that information. So we'll first look about what is the problem? Do we know who's emitting the methane emissions, how much is being emitted, and why are emissions occurring? We then think about what are the solutions. So are we thinking about incentives? Are we thinking about a technology that might be able to be installed or an operational practice that might be able to be used? Are we just trying to detect more emissions? Because often for oil and gas, for example, we're asking companies to go out, look more frequently. If they can find an emission, how fast can they fix it? And what are the regulatory tools to really implement those options? And then thinking about the implementation considerations. Cost is always a factor for an EPA regulation. Is there associated infrastructure needs? So if you're capturing the gas, what are you doing with that gas? Is there a market for that gas that you're capturing? And then legal uncertainty. I'll talk about some of the EPA rules, but every climate rule ends up in the courts. And so what does that mean as a company is trying to make an investment decision? Can they make that decision in confidence that it's going to stick? Are we in a moment, though, that everything keeps changing every time we have a different presidential election? And then what are the political assessments? As we'll talk about for ag, there's a lot of politics if you're asking a farmer to change its behavior versus requiring, for example, an oil and gas company to make an investment decision. And then finally, what are the indirect and direct benefits? And how do rules, the oil and gas sector faces a lot of different rules, not just of methane, and thinking through what are the interactions and what are the incentives that happen as we think about that. So for landfills, just quickly, and I'm just going to highlight a few points because I want to get into the discussion. As Daniel was mentioning, I think there's a good understanding that EPA significantly underestimates the landfill emissions that are coming from them for methane, but it's uncertain about why some landfills are able to control emissions more. Are they operating their gas collection system differently or better? And we don't have good information about why emissions are different. So when you think about the solutions, is it requiring more landfills to install a gas collection system? EPA defines that as the best system. But why are there different operational pieces that are concepts that EPA should be requiring? And as we're thinking about technologies to better detect emissions, we don't have good information if you're going to use a drone. Does using a drone at a certain frequency allow you to achieve a certain emission reduction? EPA is going to need to know how frequently should you look at the drone, what conditions should you be doing. You're going to want EPA to have all that data to set up the regulation. And then there's different cost implication for landfills. We've got municipalities versus a large company. Those cost implications are going to be a key factor for the agency. And as I mentioned, market uncertainty. So really, we've got a data challenge here for landfills. And it's important as we think through, as EPA works on a regulation they're thinking about proposing in 2025, getting that information to EPA, those questions before they start to write the regulation, is really the opportunity, but also the challenge. For ag, it's really different. I think we understand the problem. As Danielle said, the estimates and what we're estimating is pretty close to what they're seeing. But we really only have financial incentives in terms of what policies are on the books for the moment, because it's really costly to implement it. So even with the incentives that we've got from different states and the federal government, they're too high to really shift, to overcome the barriers that we're seeing. And then, as I mentioned, the political challenges are a challenge to think through. So cost and politics are really the barrier to regulating ag at the moment. For oil and gas, I think it's a little bit different. We do understand emissions, how much emissions are coming from oil and gas, but there's a gap between the satellite information and the estimates that we're doing from the bottom-up estimates from the greenhouse gas reporting rule. So thinking through, how do you close that gap in information? And as EPA sets a standard, it really is a find and fix standard, but we lack sufficient information to set a performance standard. So we're not able to say if everybody does this technology, they will reduce by X amount and therefore require X amount reduction. And that's a challenge, I think, for the moment. EPA has finalized a rule, though. It took 3 years in the making to get that rule through the regulatory process, and now it's in the courts. So we're waiting to see what happens with that. But generally, we understand, and EPA has required people to operate their systems better, design them better, and deploy a combination of technologies to find and fix those leaks better. So not only are you using the handheld cameras to go out and look for leaks, but you can use aerial surveys and drones and satellites as well. But litigation uncertainty, I think, is an important factor. The petitioners challenging those rules have asked the Supreme Court to pause the regulation, and so we'll see what the court does on that. And then we have the political uncertainty of a presidential election. And the last time the Trump administration was in office, you saw a lot of rollbacks. And so I think there is, at the moment, a pause of everyone waiting to see what happens on both of those. At the same time, and I hope we can discuss this in the Q&A, there are a lot of market drivers that's forcing companies to really think about how they want to reduce their emissions. And the data and the information from some of the satellites are really putting a light on that and showing what the real emissions are. But here, I think the data, the legal and regulatory and political uncertainty creates some uncertainty and some challenges. So quickly, just a last slide. As we think through where there's information that's needed and how stakeholders can engage, landfills, I think we need more information about how much is being emitted and why emissions are occurring, or why control technologies are achieving different emission profiles. And then for ag, I think it's really what is the right policy tool and how much money do we need to put into the public debate about how to reduce emissions. But the legal and the cost and the market uncertainty, I think, is a huge barrier for the ag regulations. For oil and gas, we've got a lot of information, and it is more about translating that information into EPA's regulation and helping EPA understand how they might design a regulation, knowing that the information is coming up so fast. And when you think about the regulatory process and the bureaucratic process, it's 2 to 3 years. And so how do you change sort of that ship that gets moving 2 years ago when the information is getting better and better a year ago? And so that's a challenge. But the legal uncertainty and the regulatory drivers and the interaction of all these different rules is also a challenge that I think faces the oil and gas industry. So I'll stop there, and we can really shift to some of the Q&A.
Great. As we set up the Q&A, I was just gonna, because I know we're gonna talk about landfills, but I think you prompted the trade conversation, which I think is really fascinating. So today we saw the EPA is going to the Supreme Court to defend the methane rule. I was at the beginning of this morning with the IEA with a whole bunch of oil and gas companies saying that they're going to go for near zero. Maybe they could support the rule too publicly instead of having the states challenge, But obviously, an important thing I wanted to ask you is, if these rules are not in play, there will be a methane fee. And there's also the import standards that Daniel described. How do you think these things are going to interact? I mean, because it's a new era. It's not just command and control anymore. Now there's trade and there's carbon pricing mechanisms.
Yeah, I do think about... Okay. I do think about the trade, because I think the EU, as people have mentioned, have regulations in place. And so the question is, how does the EU design its regulations, and how can the US companies who want to export really have use the data to be transparent and show that they are reducing their emissions. I think, though, it's going to need to be transparent. So the satellites that we can talk about give people some information about whether emissions are going down, but the aerial surveys are also going to be important to make sure that a company can demonstrate that it is actually meeting that target. DOE also has its measurement, monitoring, and verification program that they're trying to stand up to allow companies to have a common sort of way of talking about emissions, and I think that's also going to be critical as well.
Great. We have a question in the back. Do we? No? Oh, I guess you're holding this microphone. I thought it was you. Okay, good. There we go. There's another question. Of course, there's going to be many questions.
Thanks. David Moffett with the Inlances Fund, and we've supported 35 methane reduction projects in the U.S., financed them. Most recently, 1 million tons on a soda ash mine in Wyoming. And that's almost exclusively thanks to California's cap and trade program. And frankly, if the price was higher, we would just go up the abatement curve and do more and more. So I'd love to hear maybe more about other opportunities, maybe outside of a focus on the EPA.
Anybody want to take it?
I mean, I think especially as we walk into election, there's a lot of opportunity for states. I think California's been a leader on ag and landfills, and Colorado and California also on oil and gas. And that is where a lot of innovation happens that allows then EPA to demonstrate that these technologies or these approaches are important. So I think that those are critical, and the price on methane or carbon is also important. So you mentioned the IRA methane fee. EPA is still trying to design that, but if there is a methane fee and a tax on methane emissions from oil and gas, I think it'll be interesting to see what the implications are, similar to what you're mentioning for California.
Right in the middle.
Thank you. I don't know if that works. There. Church Lewis, I'm working on methane emission credit projects in Southeast Asia. You mentioned that the cost for emission abatement in agriculture was too high, and if you could elaborate on that, because that's not what we're seeing in Southeast Asia from alternate wetting and drying of rice cultivation. It's actually a pretty low-cost remedy, and depending upon the price of the emission credits, it definitely will benefit the farmers and the other catalytic facilitators of that program.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Rice presents a big opportunity to decrease methane emissions significantly. We know how to change the practices. There's work on high-yield cultivars that can work for upland rice. I think we were commenting more on livestock. And this is a very difficult task, and it's not very clear that the margin of return that we can get from trying to decrease methane emission from livestock is at this point worth it. because of all the difficulties associated with that. But rice, definitely.
A question in the back, and I'll make a comment and a plug about the methane hub. We've been funding around $55 million this year, along with the Bezos Earth Fund, on breakthroughs on the livestock methane. And we're going to start with a rice accelerator to also start doing research, because we've had billions of dollars on clean tech, on e-mobility, but we've only done less than 100 million on research on the biggest source of methane, which is livestock. So we have a question, I think, right there.
Yeah, my name's David Miller, class of 1981, and I'm the author of a book called Solved: How the Great Cities of the World Are Fixing the Climate Crisis. From an urban perspective, methane emissions are very connected with the distribution use of natural gas. And both of you have mentioned the politics here, but nobody's really talked in a way that would help change politics. And I'm wondering if you could comment a bit. Our studies at C40 Cities, where I work, show that because of methane emissions, in the United States, heating and cooling buildings by natural gas is the biggest single contributor to climate change. And if we're going to have emissions by 2030, as we must, action there is critical. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how to frame this problem of methane in a narrative that connects it with one of the sources in a way that allows elected officials actually to make the rapid progress we need. And by the way, great panel and great work. Thank you very much.
We are focused, my presentation was focused on how do you reduce methane from the product. I do think that's reducing the demand also is the critical piece. We've got other folks in our program who are working on state policies to reduce demand and electrify buildings. I think those are two different but equally important pathways to reduce methane emissions. Agree.
There's a question out in the back, and another plug. Research at Stanford University has shown that the indoor air quality problems with natural gas is that it's like inviting a smoker in terms of benzene. So I think there's many health benefits that could be brought, and this is something that has nothing to do with climate, and many people in jurisdictions will support. Out there in the middle, I think I saw somebody.
Hi, thank you. Adam Wasserman from FinPublica. I was wondering if you could just explain in layperson's terms what the EPA needs to now show in order to have the methane rule survive legal scrutiny, especially with the Supreme Court getting rid of court deference to agencies.
So I will say, I think the Biden administration, I'll start, the Supreme Court hasn't used the Chevron doctrine in many years, and so I think all of the Biden administration's recent rules have not been designed to rely on the Chevron doctrine, so which is a deference to an agency. So I think that puts the Biden administration's rules on a good footing. I think there's a lot of different arguments of why the petitioners are raising to the Supreme Court to pause the rule. I think one of them is the fact that people need to start to make investments now, and states have to start to make plans. And so the petitioners are arguing for the Supreme Court to pause it. Then the merits themselves are going to be in the DC Circuit, and that case will start briefing in November and go through April. And there's a host of rules of whether the requirements are too costly, whether they're technology feasible. It's a long list of different ways that they're trying to challenge the rule. I think there are some companies who want durable rules, and so the question is, are there some tweaks that make sense? And EPA has some petitions before it to maybe make some tweaks, and then that would, I think, pull some of those issues out of the DC Circuit and the Supreme Court. At the moment, though, I think the layperson's way is everyone is putting everything in the Supreme Court and asking them to pause these cases, and it's whether it's methane, hazardous air pollutants, power plant rules. And so I think it's more of a trend and a larger issue that we have in our courts at the moment, as opposed to something that's specific to methane.
We've got a couple more questions possible up there in the front. Thanks.
Hi, Raphael Cardi. I teach about climate innovation at Stern. Just great work on methane and really focusing on 2030. Glad to see this. Just wanted to follow up on one of your comments, Dan, in which you mentioned that the problem with livestock is really hard. And two recent sort of technologies I've heard about, I was wondering to get your perspective on could they move the needle there. One is actually changing the feeds for livestock, which some estimates say could reduce 30-40% or so from their actual production. Another one I've heard about is almost like a point capture of the methane generated around the livestock, like we do with CCS for for carbon dioxide. Do you see either or both of those as ways or other things to address this hard problem of the livestock production?
Daniel?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question, and there's definitely potential there. And I think to follow up on what Carrie was saying, it's just very hard. It's very hard in part because there's a lot of individual farmers out there. A lot of the problem with livestock is in the tropics. It's very difficult, I think, to reach that population. You change cattle feed, as you say, you may get 30-40% benefit. Okay, but many other sources, we can shut them down. Rice, we can shut down the emission from rice if we change practices. Dairies, concentrated dairies, we can capture the methane. But in many parts of the world, the cattle are much more distributed than what we have in concentrated dairy. It's just a hard problem. Not that we shouldn't do it, and I'm glad that Global Methane Hub is investing in it. But it seems like there's lower hanging fruit.
Last one out there in the back.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry. Thank you so much. Wonderful panel. Dana Bray from Yale Law School. Just a quick comment in response to the discussion of animal agriculture mitigation. It does seem from everything I read that the technological responses are either limited in their scalability or feasibility or even the amount of absolute reductions that they can obtain. But I just wanted, on the demand side, as you were discussing, we haven't talked about today what is quite a simple fix in some ways to animal agriculture mitigation, which is dietary change and reducing consumption of meat and dairy. And particularly in a country like the US, where we have such high per capita consumption, I think that's one of the policy fixes that we should really be focusing on. And there are countries in Europe, like Denmark, that are already doing a good job on that. Thank you.
Any comments on behavior change solutions?
I can't comment. Taking away people's hamburgers.
Yeah, maybe one last question right there. There is a paper in Nature that came out a little while ago which showed two truths: that there's people probably should reduce their meat intake substantially, and there's probably some that should increase because of the nutritional value, and live simply so others can simply live is a good thing, and I think both things could be quite true in the middle there.
So Dan Crisafulli, I'm a partner with an investment fund looking for sustainability opportunities. One we're seeing in waste management. We're seeing the larger waste management companies invest in capture based on the price for what they're calling renewable natural gas through the RINs. What are the limits of these quasi-market-based approaches versus technological approaches? Can we just expect the RINs to continue to solve this problem if we get the price right?
I'm a lawyer who works on regulation, so I have a biased answer. I would say I don't think it's enough to rely on the market. I do think the market helps an agency, or whether it be federal or state, design a regulation to be better, to require that and sort of make sure it's a backstop. But I think you need both to be successful. There has to be, the markets help lower the cost, which allows the regulation to make sure that people make those investment decisions, and enforce to make sure people are complying and operating those systems in a transparent and reliable way. Exactly, right, exactly, yep.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'll just make one last comment, of course, because I'm a commentator here. The oil and gas rule that the EU, if fully enforced, it will reduce global emissions 33% if you look at the current import. So that's a massive thing. So we've seen across the world that people are actually gearing up for that, and so trade, which has been sort of not your typical NGO tool, can be a very powerful way to actually drive change. So despite of the politics that might ensue in the US, if you want to get that European market, that's what you have to do. And I've been working in Argentina with Milei officials, and they know, they could believe whatever they want to talk about climate, but if they want to go to Europe, they want to have to fix those leaks. So I think that's really powerful new world because of this new accountability tools that we have.
I will add one more thing if I have a minute. The satellite information, as it becomes public, I think the companies, oil and gas companies, especially in the US and EU, care about investor pressure too. So if there is a transparent information about where leaks are coming from and you have a big super emitter problem from a certain company, they're not going to want to be on that list. And so that's another pressure that I think comes from increased data.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Marcelo, Daniel, and Carrie. Let's give them a round of applause.